Liebe Referentin, liebe Gäste, liebe Tagungsteilnehmende,
good afternoon, dear experts, dear participants of the annual conference of the Council for Migration. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the organizational team. We are very delighted that this conference may take place despite of the difficulties of the fourth corona wave in Germany. We had planned this with limited participants and as a hybrid event, but now it's taking place on Zoom. And some of us are based in the Hygienemuseum, such as Stefan Kretzmann and the technical team. Mr. Böhm of the Hygienemuseum and Alexander Zobel of SAM Production in charge of the streaming. And I'd like to thank them for their flexibility and their highly appreciated support with the last-minute changes and the hybrid format. Conjunctures of Racism, our title for this program, is a form of the cited so-called social discourse which is unstable. If this is the case, we have to highlight the different regional and historical contexts in order to understand the logics behind it and to identify ways to fight against racism. The contradictory context of Europe in the context of race and bodies, we're trying to put this into context. George Floyd and its murder by a police officer led to the fact that there's more support for the anti-racist movement, Black Lives Matter. Racism and anti-Semitism is still existent in the German society, which was not only seen by the murders in Hanau or Kassel. The awareness of racism is growing in civil society. Maria Alexopoulos, in her contribution, says that we are more ready than ever to talk about racism. But still, in Germany, talking about racism and the terminology as such is still characterized by the Nazi regime, which makes it more difficult to highlight it in a contemporary context. Then we talk about xenophobia or the far right related to racist behavior or practices, but it rather de-thematizes racism as such. Our offensive use of race in our conference had the intention to have a provocant counterpoint. The Council for Migration is trying to deal with this topic. This is why in Dresden we chose a city which is not only characterized by this discourse and is becoming more and more important in this context, talking about the far-right party AfD and so on. Insofar, Dresden is also a symbolically charged place, talking about racism in the context of migration. The correlation between body and racism makes it more visual and is meant as a symbol for today. We have a special focus on the body and its political dimension in the context of coloniality and migration. The body of the other as a construct for racification. The Hygienemuseum Dresden is an important social actor as a place for education and critical discourse, talking about body and society, body and policy, body and contemporary history. This is why we chose this conference to be held in these rooms. I'd like to thank for the very constructive and down-to-earth approach from Dr. Ilmer and Mrs. Heinig from Hygienemuseum Dresden. Within the organizational work with anti-racist and civil society actors in place, we also organized a festival taking place at the same time with this conference in different places in Dresden. We have creative discourse on racism. Some of this was able to be put in the Zoom format, such as reading, a dance performance that was meant to attract our visitors in our big welcome hall, and which is now displayed in Zoom. Us, the Council for Migration, is a network of 180 critical migration researchers, which was founded in 1980 and which is constantly growing, many of them non-white people. We deal with the meaning of migration to shape and change society, which is also about political decisions and open debates of immigration, migration, displacement, asylum, and so on, and to comment media contributions. An important format for this is our annual conference. The continuity of our work was facilitated thanks to the counseling and financial support of Freudenberg Foundation. Our activities also include our debates for the Council for Migration that you may follow on our website, where colleagues react to different contributions with critical and constructive contribution. This year it was shaped by Maria Alexiopoulou, asking which research for racism do we need in Germany, and which was commented by different experts. We have short and reader-friendly contributions. I'd like to invite you to participate in the panel discussions and the workshop discussion with renowned international scientists where we try to go beyond the European central perspective. I'd like to invite you to actively participate in our discussions. Support us trying to find answers on how to put this topic into different contexts in Germany and in Europe. It's our aim to not only stay within science, but also to use conclusions from science and results from our conference to shape political education. We try to be an interface of science and practical political education. This is the moment to say thank you for the Federal Agency for Civic Education for their financial and counseling support. This is why I'm especially delighted to welcome the President of the Federal Agency for Civic Education, Professor Dr. Krüger, who recorded a welcome note that will be played after my contribution. Unfortunately, we will not be able to play the music title that we intended to play due to GEMA license problems. We therefore suggest you the title from Laila Akeni. And then I'd like to forward to the head of the science department, Dr. Ilmer. Also, I'd like to thank our sign language interpreter, Christine Erd, and her colleague, and our interpreters, Ms. Erben, Ms. Lipanska and Ms. Ursinus. I'd also like to thank our employees, Stefan Kretzmer and Marie Dudek, who helped us to organize this conference and who were highly committed to assist us. This is my last contribution as the chair for the Council for Migration. Mr. Lucianus will then dive into the conference content-wise after a short break. I am looking forward to fruitful discussions and with hoping that we may make a contribution to fight racism here and elsewhere. Thank you. Mrs. Professor Karakashokla, dear participants of the Migration Council, let me cite, and it's because I'm black, I'm the fastest runner, I'm the best employee, and it's because my commitment is not appreciated and I'm often underestimated. As the rapper Leila Kili from Cologne says, that how the varietal of inherent characteristic is present. Even though racism nowadays is rather shown in its culturalization instead of racification and biological depreciation, the mechanisms still remain the same. They create devaluation, inequalities and exclusion, which has always consequences for individuals, but also impacts on the political and social discourse, where we see reciprocal correlations of exclusion, for example, the correlation of anti-Semitic and colonial violence, and often the combination of migration defense and a cultural chauvinistic attitude. Let me point out the example of Afghanistan. In space that was left alone, and with a government deprived of power, we have to ask ourselves how accidental discourse is displayed here. First of all, as narrative of the so-called supposed inability of the locals and the soldiers. The space is imaginated as an archaic tribe community, unable for modern social attitudes, where we see a culture chauvinistic attitude, and then it's often highlighted that the open door policy of 2015 shall by no means be repeated. So we see a distortion and migration defense is in the foreground. Political education and emancipated political education has to deal with the structural level of racism. Mari Matsuda, one of the early developers of the configurate theory, said, I cite, the problem is not bad people, the problem is a system that produces bad outcomes. A system that, such as here as Naika Furka, a migration scientist, says, the culture power of some social groups and uses this to justify the inequality of other social groups, or as Lenya Kili raps, it's because I'm black that I'm often undervalued. Our work in political education is meant to be the interface of scientific debate and culture and social developments on the other hand. Ideas for formats and the implementation for political education shall work hand in hand. And I'm not telling anything new when I say that this discourse is entangled and depends on different backgrounds, different levels of knowledge and insights to society. The fundament, the basis of our political education. A central question is therefore how we can shape debate and development and bring it to the people. Our culture offers have for a long time
Wir müssen raus zu den Menschen und nicht darauf warten, dass sie unsere Angebote irgendwann schon in Anspruch nehmen.
Was for a long time unable to take the message out to the people. There were two studies carried out by the Sinos on Politics Institute that showed that especially those the relatively uneducated have a high demand for political education, and often we don't manage to reach out to those parts of society. In the context of racism, many of the concepts have to be put into practice and are invisible, which is why we have to make the
Wir nennen
people
das aufsuchende
or
politische
turn the
Bildung.
people
Und diese
into the
aufsuchende politische
basis
Bildung bietet genau
of
hierfür die
political
entsprechenden Potenziale,
education.
denn sie ist unmittelbar an die Alltagswelten der Menschen
We have to
gekoppelt.
design our concepts
Projekte der
based
aufsuchenden
on the
politischen
daily
Bildung
routines of
kennzeichnet,
those people.
dass sie sich an die Menschen in ihren jeweiligen
We have
Sozialräumen, zum
to
Beispiel dem
shape
Betrieb
our
oder dem
political
eigenen Kiez
education
wenden.
based
Es geht um
on
die Verbindung von
people's
Lebenswelt,
neighborhoods,
Gesellschaft
people's
und Politik,
workplaces,
damit die Menschen im Sozialraum
to
den
shape a
Zusammenhang zwischen den
change
Anforderungen, die sie im Alltag zu bewältigen
and to
haben,
understand
und den zugrunde
or make
liegenden
people
gesellschaftlichen
understand
und
their daily
politischen Strukturen
challenges
herstellen können.
and challenges of
Solche
political and
Ansätze
social
der Lebenswelt
structures.
und
Such
Subjektorientierung
approaches of
bedeuten für die politische Bildung
subject-orientated
nicht nur, dass sie
political
unterschiedliche
education
Angebote
means
für
that
verschiedene
we
Menschen zur
are
Verfügung
not
stellt.
only
Sie muss diese
supposed
vielmehr mit den
to
Menschen angepasst
offer
an ihre jeweiligen
different
alltagsweltlichen
programs, but we
Sozialräume
also have
entwickeln.
to adapt them
Dafür muss sich
to
die Profession
people's social
öffnen,
spaces. We have to
thematisch,
open up
räumlich, aber auch methodisch.
from a
Bezüglich
thematic,
benachteiligter
spatial
oder exkludierter Gruppen geht es mitunter darum, in einem
attitude.
ersten Schritt die
We have to
Erfahrung
reach
der
out to
Menschen
the
aufzugreifen
excluded
und erst
and
sekundär Themen des
to
politischen Lernens daraus
understand
zu
people's
entwickeln.
experiences
Die
and then based on
Thematisierung
that
von verschiedenen
elaborate
Sozialisations-
our
und Lebenserfahrungen frei
educational
von Schuldzuweisung
programs
und gegenseitigen
without
Verdächtigungen ist elementarer Bestandteil von
pointing someone
Bildungsprozessen und damit
guilty.
gerade auch von politischer Bildung.
This is fundamental
wichtiges
to
Handlungsfeld
political
ist hierbei die
education. An
Arbeitswelt.
important
Sie ist
part
neben
is the workplace
Sensibilisierung
here.
gegenüber Alltagsrassismus vor allem
We have to
aber auch
raise
der Aspekt der
awareness
Partizipation
in
und
terms of
Teilhabe wichtig.
daily racism
Diesen Zusammenhang
and
betonen eigentlich
participation.
alle aktuellen Studien.
This is a
Im Rahmen des
correlation shown by all
Soziale
of the studies
Lebenslagen und
carried out
demokratische
nowadays.
Integration konnte zum Beispiel die Hans-Böckler-Stiftung jüngst
Hans
akzentuieren,
Böckler
wie stark
Foundation
antidemokratische
found, for
Einstellungen
example,
allgemein
how
und
anti-democratic
menschenfeindliche
attitudes
Ressentiments im Besonderen
and
mit sozialen Lebenslagen und
xenophobic
insbesondere deren Rezeption
ressentiments
korrelieren.
correlate with the living
Erwerbstätigkeit, die als sicher
situations.
empfunden wird, Gestaltungsmöglichkeiten in
Someone
Job und Alltag
who
sowie
perceives his or her
gesellschaftliche
job
und
as
betriebliche
secure
Anerkennung des
and
eigenen Beitrags sind demnach die
valuated,
beste Medizin
appreciated
gegen sogenannte kompensatorische
seems to
Abwertung.
be the best
Wer
medicine
selbst
or best
Ohnmacht und die
remedy
Abwertung
against
des eigenen
political
Beitrags zu einem
devaluation.
Ganzen auch und gerade im Arbeitsleben erfährt, der
Someone
oder
who
die
feels
ist
appreciated
eher geneigt, sich
in
selbst
his or her
abwertend zu
workplace
verhalten, bevorzugt
is
werden
less
dann als
likely
anders
to
markierte Kollektive verachtet.
depreciate others.
Im Lichte dieser Korrelation
In the light
erhalten
of
die
this
Arbeit des
correlation,
Londoner Soziologen
the work of
Thomas
the
H. Marshall über demokratische
sociologist
Beteiligung
H.
im
Marshall
Arbeitsleben, von Marshall Industrial
on
Citizenship genannt, eine
industrial
neue Aktualität.
citizenship are more
Aktuelle Forschung
topical
etwa
than
des Basler Wirtschafts-
ever.
und Gesellschaftswissenschaftlers Oliver
Studies
Nachtwey
by
oder auch die aktuelle
Oliver
Leipziger
Nachtwey
Autoritarismusstudie
or
zeigen,
the
je
Leipziger
höher der Industrial
authoritarianism
Citizenship, desto
study
niedriger ist die
says
Zustimmung
that
zu
the higher the industrial
Ungleichwertigkeitsideologien, wie zum
citizenship,
Beispiel
the less
Muslimfeindlichkeit,
likely
Sexismus
someone
oder
is
eben
to become
Rassismus. Meine Damen und Herren, Sie merken, die
misanthropic
Beobachtungen in unserem
or
Aktionsfeld knüpfen
hostile against
unmittelbar an die heutige
Muslims.
Tagung und die
Ladies
Auseinandersetzung
and
der
gentlemen,
Konjunkturen des Rassismus
conjunctures
an.
of
Ich freue mich
racism
daher sehr
is a
über Ihre
topic
Tagung
more
und wünsche
topical
ihr einen
than ever,
guten
so
Verlauf,
I'm very much looking
spannende
forward to
Diskussionen
our
und
conference
Erkenntnisse
today,
und
looking
hoffentlich auch
forward
den
to
ein
new
oder anderen
conclusions,
Hinweis,
new
wie die großen
ideas
Herausforderungen unserer
and
Profession
for
in der
new
Zukunft
solutions
leisten können. Ich
on
darf
how
Sie im
to
Namen der Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung herzlich grüßen.
manage
Unsere Kolleginnen und
our
Kollegen verfolgen
nowadays
ihre Arbeit mit
challenges.
großer Aufmerksamkeit.
A very warm
Alles Gute.
welcome on behalf of the colleagues of my organization, and my colleagues follow your work with great attention. Thank you very much.
Ein herzliches Hallo auch noch von meiner Seite. Guten Tag, liebe Teilnehmer der
Welcome from
Jahrestagung
my
Rasse,
side
Migration, Körper und Rasse,
on
Konjunkturen von
behalf
Rassismus in Europa.
of my
Ich begrüße
team.
Sie abschließend nun noch im Namen des Deutschen Hygienemuseums zu dieser
On
Tagung.
behalf
Mein Name
of
ist Susanne
Deutsches
Ilmer und ich leite hier am
Hygienemuseum, my
Deutschen
name is
Hygienemuseum
Susanne
die
Ilmer.
Abteilung
I'm
Wissenschaft
in the
Veranstaltung.
head
Unsere
of
Abteilung
the
ist dafür
Science and
verantwortlich oder
Events
zuständig, die
department in
wissenschaftlich-kulturellen
charge
Rahmenprogramme zu unseren
of
Ausstellungen zu
designing
entwerfen, also die
the
Diskussionen,
framework
Workshops,
programs of our
Tagungen, Symposien
exhibitions, such as
oder eben auch
symposiums,
Festivals. Nun mögen Sie sich
festivals,
fragen,
and so
wie ich
on.
zu der Ehre dieses
Now,
Grußwortes
you
komme.
may
Zum einen, Frau
wonder
Karakasoglu hat es
why
gesagt,
I was
war die
asked to
Tagung bis vor
welcome you.
wenigen
First
Tagen
of all,
noch
as Mrs.
als
Karakachova
hybride
already
Tagung
mentioned,
bei uns aus
until
dem
a few
Museum
days ago
geplant.
we
Hier
had
hätten wir Sie
planned
natürlich
this
gern
conference
persönlich am
as a
Veranstaltungsort
hybrid
begrüßt als Partner der
event, and
Tagung.
we would have
Und
loved to
nun
welcome
nehme ich
you
die
on site
Vertretung
at
des
our
Museums auch
museum.
virtuell wahr.
Now
Aber so
I'm
fragen Sie sich
representing
vielleicht,
our museum
wo ist denn die
virtually,
aktuelle
and you may ask
Sonderausstellung, zu
yourself,
der jetzt
where
diese
is the
Tagung das
special
Diskursprogramm
exhibition
darstellt? Hier kann ich Ihnen
located?
sagen, dass die beiden Themenfelder der Jahrestagung
Both
Körper
topics,
und Rasse,
body and
die
race,
institutionelle Eigengeschichte des Museums seit seiner Gründung
have always been
1912
part
durchziehen
of the
und bis heute
institutional
Gegenstand der kritischen Auseinandersetzung im Museum sind und dies auf mehreren Ebenen, der thematischen Ebene unserer
work
Programme, also der Ausstellungen,
regarding the
Diskussionsveranstaltungen,
topics
aber auch
that
der
we work
praktischen
on,
Ebene unserer
but also
Arbeitsweisen
on
und
a
Strukturen.
practical
Dies
level,
hat den Rat für Migration
our
sicherlich zur
structures
Auswahl
and
dieses
so on.
Tagungsorts bewogen,
This is
neben
why
dem
we
exponierten, neben
chose,
der
or why
exponierten
the
Rolle, die
Council for
Dresden natürlich bei dem
Migration
Thema spielt.
chose this place
Das diese Tagung
for
begleitende
the annual
Kulturfestival trägt den
conference. The
programmatischen
cultural
Titel
festival is
Rassismus
called
verlernen. Das
Unlearning
impliziert,
Racism,
dass Rassismus
which
auch irgendwann
implies
gelernt
that
wird.
racism
Die
is also
Tagung wiederum
learned at
stellt in
some
einigen
stage.
Panels eine
Our
explizite Verbindung
conference
zwischen
has
Räumen
an
und
explicit
Rassismus her.
correlation
Und ja,
between
die
spaces and
rassismuskritische
racism,
Kulturarbeit der
and
letzten Jahre hat
racism
gezeigt, dass
critical
Museen
work of the
durchaus
last years
Orte sind,
showed
an
that
denen
museums
Rassismus gelernt wird.
are
Und dies
or
auch
can
wieder auf
be
mehreren Ebenen.
places where
Auf der Ebene
racism
des
is
explizit und
learned
implizit vermittelten Wissens, auf
explicitly
der
or
Ebene der
implicitly
beteiligten
when
Expertinnen
learning
und in der Zusammensetzung des
knowledge,
Publikums.
or
Bei
also
den letzten beiden
regarding
Ebenen
the
zeigt sich
experts
nämlich,
involved,
dass
where
Museen
we
häufig
see
noch immer
that
keine
museums
Orte sind, an denen nicht weiße Menschen
are
arbeiten,
often
nicht weiße Menschen ihre Expertise einbringen, in denen sie mit ihren Themen
no
repräsentiert
places
sind
yet
oder
where
diese besuchen.
non-white people
Das
are
kann jeder als eine
represented, where
Art
they
stille
work,
Norm oder
or where they
implizites Wissen lernen,
may
der aktuell
identify
Museen
with
besucht.
or
Das wurde im
visit
Zuge der
museums.
postkolonialen Debatten der letzten Jahre
In the
erkannt und ändert
framework
sich
of
nun auch langsam.
post-colonial
Das Deutsche
debate,
Hygienemuseum, für
this
das
is
ich heute
about to
stehe, ist da keine
change. The
Ausnahme. Im
Deutsche
Gegenteil,
Hygienemuseum is
über
no
Jahrzehnte
exception
war
here.
es ein Ort, der ganz
For
explizit und implizit
many
rassistisches Wissen
years,
verbreitet.
it used to be a
So stehe
place
ich hier im
where
Themenraum 1
racist
unserer Dauerausstellung
knowledge
Abenteuer
was
Mensch
distributed, and
vor der Ikone des Museums, unserem wahrscheinlich bekanntesten
I'm
Objekt der
here
gläsernen Frau.
standing next
Sie
to the
entspricht in
glass
Körperhaltung
woman,
und in Bauweise dem ersten gläsernen Mann,
which
den das Museum bei der Eröffnung des
is similar
Museumsgebäudes
to the first
1930 präsentierte.
glass
Auf den ersten
man
Blick ist vielleicht der
that used to
Zusammenhang zum
represent
Thema Körper
our
und Rasse nicht gleich ersichtlich, aber es
museum
ist
in
genau diese mit dem gläsernen
1933.
Mann vertretene Körpernorm des
But
männlichen,
it's
gesunden,
just this
funktionsfähigen
norm of the
Idealkörpers,
healthy
die
and
eine große
functional
Wirksamkeit entfaltet hat und
body,
implizit all jene Körper ausschloss, die dieser
which
Norm nicht entsprachen.
excluded all
Seit
bodies
seiner
that did
Gründung
not
im
meet
Gefolge
this
der ersten
norm.
internationalen Hygieneausstellung
Since its
1911 war das
foundation and the
Museum
first
an der
exhibition
Verbreitung
in
des
1911,
Rassendiskurses und von
the Deutsche
rassetheoretischem Wissen
Museum
beteiligt.
was
Bereits die
involved
erste
in the
internationale
distribution of
Hygieneausstellung
racist
1911 hatte eine
knowledge.
eigene
The
Abteilung
first
Rassenhygiene und auch die
exhibition,
großen und viel
1911,
besuchten
had its
Wanderausstellungen, die
own
das Museum bis
department of
1933
racist hygiene,
konzipiert hatte, hatten alle eine eigene
and all
Abteilung
of the other
Verwerbung und Rassenhygiene.
migratory
Nach
exhibition
1933 wurde das Museum
included
zur führenden Propagandainstitution der NS-Rassepolitik, unter anderem mit Ausstellungen wie Volk und Rasse,
racist
Reichsschau, ewiges Volk oder durch die federführende Beteiligung an dem
methodologies
Groß, an der
and
großen
so on.
Reichsausstellung Wunder des Lebens von 1935. Es ist jetzt nicht der Ort, auf die Brüche
This is
und
not the
Kontinuitäten dieser
place
Thematiken auch
to
nach
talk
1945
about
einzugehen oder auf
disruptions
die
and
Rolle und Funktion des
continuities
Museums während der
after
DDR-Zeit. In jedem
1932
Fall
or during
kam
the
es
GDR regime,
1990 zu einer
but in
konzeptionellen
1990
Neuausrichtung des Museums.
we
Seither ist
had
auch die eigene
we
Geschichte
started
und die hier
to
produzierten
unfold a new
Menschenbilder
orientation of
Gegenstand
our
der
conceptual
Aufarbeitung und kritischen
work,
Auseinandersetzung in
trying to
großen Ausstellungsprojekten
critically
geworden. Ich
deal
nenne hier
with
nur Der neue Mensch,
historic
Obsessionen des 20. Jahrhunderts 1999,
exhibition
Fremdkörper,
forms such
fremde
as
Körper, tödliche Medizin, Rassenwahn im Nationalsozialismus und zuletzt
the Nazi regime, or the exhibition on the new Germany in 2014, or the exhibition Racism in 2018, Invention of Human Race. This last exhibition was an immense challenge for us and also an institutional turning point. Apart from the curatorial challenge to deal with this topic without reproducing the topics, it triggered an new reflection process on who talks at exhibitions, who works at our museums, and who participates in the public debate. This exhibition was elaborated together with experts, people of color. Looking for a title was already a big challenge. First of all, we decided to take the title Phantom Race, thinking that races do not exist from a biological approach. Thanks to the curatorial advisory council, this idea was rejected because for white people, for us white people, race may be a phantom, but for others, race may be a reality, which is only one example for our own colorblindness here. The exhibition enabled us to work on structures regarding our staff and to include non-white experts, where we created a position to create and to counsel this change process here at our museum. And now, building the bridge to how I started, we aim at converting this museum into a place where racism is not only learned but also unlearned. So we are very delighted for this cooperation together with the Council for Migration. Unfortunately, we're not able to have this conference on site. Nevertheless, I'd like to thank Mrs. Karakacholu, Mr. Kretschmer. I am sorry you are not able to be here in Dresden, and I'm very much looking forward to our 3-day conference. Thank you.
Kann ich anfangen?
May I start?
Ja, fantastisch.
Great.
Vielen Dank, liebe Freunde und Freundinnen.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues.
Erstmal provisorisch Freunde und Freundinnen.
I would love to call you friends of the post-colonial and post-migrant society of a post-colonial Europe, and we'll see and find out why. I prefer calling you that. National right-wing parties, nationalist parties in Europe. That is the way an extremism researcher tries to define this phenomenon, is a national and social dystopia that is established with authoritarian instruments and measures. In Europe, we see that the concept of race is resurfacing, and also nationalist ideas in a combination with a neo-patriarchal anti-feminism or anti-Muslim racism, as well as other ideas, constitute the core elements of a mainstreaming attempt of neo-racist hegemonies in Europe. This goes hand in hand with a change towards post-migrant and post-colonial societies that are and they try to turn these accomplishments around again. Networks and think tanks try to tackle that, but there are alternative facts, fake news that even reach science or pseudoscience, and that even reaches the authorities that are actually responsible for protecting the constitution in Germany. I quote, people would have to allege that I am reframing things and allege that I have views which I do not have, and that is something the ex-president Hans-Georg Maaßen of the Constitutional Protection Agency in Germany expressed. And he was often in contact with right-wing extremist bloggers and people that have actually been revealed to be right-wing extremists by this authority. Nevertheless, racism is not an exclusive everyday business of organized illiberalism in Europe, but also of trivial and everyday practices embedded in our systems and flexible when it comes to the victimization of its addressees. Racism is trivial and something that is part of our everyday life. In 2019, Stefan, the offender, the perpetrator that killed and tried to kill citizens in a synagogue, but then killed people standing around a kebab shop, said he has nothing against Jewish people. He only holds a grudge towards people who stand behind financial power and who wouldn't. End of quote. That is something his mother said, the mother of a right-wing extremist. Racism is trivial. Anti-Semitism is also part of this. Tipicotovelli, especially for us Germans, on November 9th, had to be brought to safety after demonstrators of a pro-Palestinian demonstration threatened her. This mood was aggressive. On an Instagram profile, somebody called on other demonstrators to destroy the building. Different security officers had to bring her to her car and drive her away while demonstrators offended and threatened her. Racism as a trivial and dangerous form of anti-Semitism, or racism is if journalists and doctors Jamil Hassan suspended and later ended collaboration with the WDR TV station because, according to conservative media research of the Springer Verlag, revealed that 2014 in Berlin there were racist activities and there was a campaign against her in 2014. She was not even of age then. Hassan argued the accusations against her were a racist campaign. In the country of the offenders, she was made an anti-Semitist. Obviously, the anti-Semitism that has had a long tradition here needs to be revealed. Racism in Europe is a systemic problem, though. If in Denmark, for example, if Denmark becomes the first country in Europe that can withdraw the residence permit from refugees, then that is a problem. Fredrickson said that this is a migration policy that is escalating. In future, Denmark will not accept any refugees that try to cross the Danish-German border. Deportations towards Syria used to be taboo in past, not any longer. The most striking aspect here is a concept called Ghettoplaner. I hope I pronounced it correctly. These Ghettoplanen, these are redlinings, a list that the Danish state uses in order to record in which areas too many refugees and migrants have lived. And they use it in order to restructure that. By 2030, there will be no district in which the majority of people is made up of refugees. They also want to force them to leave their apartments by threatening to take away social welfare. That is also something Italy, the Italian state, is planning to do or already does, for example, in Rome, in order to decrease the population of refugees and migrants in certain districts. That is something that was pursued by Salvini, former Minister for the Interior in Italy. Systemic racism in Europe, and in this case in the Netherlands, affects more than 26,000 families that live at the edge of bankruptcy and that have incurred debts that they were not able to pay back. Numerous families lost their houses, apartments, and jobs. One person had even took their lives after having been asked to pay back more than 10,000 euros. These are the results and consequences of an extreme policy that was pursued by the Dutch tax agencies for many, many years. And that was the reason why the former president actually had to withdraw last year. In Germany, we didn't hear much about these developments. At the beginning of 2019, investigative journalists actually revealed the fraud committed by these persons. Actually, parents have or are entitled to receive a bonus for educating their children, but they didn't get that. Often, many years after having received the money, they are told that they need to pay it back. And that leads to the fact that parents whose children visited different institutions and received this money were accused of fraud. So through optimized systems of the so-called risk detection were selected and chosen. Interestingly enough, the people chosen had a surname that sounded as if they had a migratory background and they didn't have white skin. Also, they cannot apply for more social welfare in future. Their entitlements to these bonuses were ignored and delayed. And that meant that innocent people were actually punished. And that means that this is an example of what we call institutionalized racism in Europe. The majority of those affected actually have a post-colonial and migratory background. And based on criteria such as dual citizenship or surname with a migratory touch, were criteria used for selecting them. And that is why the people responsible were actually sentenced to different punishments, because they violated data protection regulations. In this term, in mail correspondences, officers called minorities as svanches, little black people. But that's not all. A few months before the presidential election in France, there was a conflict with Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Paris announced that the number of visas would be decreased by 50% for these three Maghreb states because they refused to accept people deported from France to these countries. For transnational migrants in France, an arbitrary rejection of family union is a punishment and reminds us of neo-colonial racism. Racism cannot be conceived of without the embodied experience of race and technologies of controlling it. Race is a technology for differences, with the main goal of producing white supremacy-based superiority. Race technologies, therefore, are a control unit of the digital externalized borders of Europe, and they are used as instruments for producing something that was called corpse frontier, an intensive calculation in order to externalize these borders, and the border bodies are race bodies. They can be digitalized, segmented, and rearranged again. There's also a debate on DNA analysis by forensics. The debate on extended DNA analysis is an example here. In the area of asylum procedures, with the analysis of so-called ethno-regional origin. On behalf of the Ministry for the Interior. And they have also launched a law. I would like to quote him. The attention during the refugee crisis in border infrastructures is a challenge for claiming that the Balkan refugee route would be a wide territory. Here are differences between white people and migrants, and that is why post-colonial populations try to distinguish themselves from migrants and refugees in order to establish the white supremacy with all different measures involved. And that is why I would like to advocate for a societal anti-racism, perhaps even a systemic anti-racism that tackles systemized racism and colonialized racism, that tries to change this on the European level. This could either haunt us as a nightmare, for example, a nightmare for the enemies of a post-migrant society, or a utopian view of friends of a post-colonial and post-migrant Europe. At the beginning of the EU, there was not only the technocratical consensus of its elites, but also the attempt of these elites to tackle militant fascism in Europe. This means that we could start a socially just society that we have fought for, and at the same time, this societal change would also coincide with the question of a decolonialized Europe. That is something we see here in our everyday lives. Friends of a post-migrant society know what I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
Hallo, ich begrüße euch zum offiziellen Beginn von unserem ersten Panel. Wir sind alle hier versammelt und wir fangen sofort an mit der Präsentation und danach mit der Diskussion der vorgestellten Ansätze. Unser Thema ist Europa, Konjunkturen des Rassismus in Europa, Europa und Race. Und die verkörperte Erfahrung von Race in Europa. Ich fange an mit der Präsentation
I'll get started with the presentation of our guest,
Alana Lentin.
Alana Lentin. She is based in a different continent, so we are extremely delighted to have her with us today. Alana Lentin is a professor for culture and sociology at the Western Sydney University. She's a Jewish European and is based in Sydney in Australia, dealing with race, racism and anti-racism. And she wrote a recent book on anti-racism and on racism in a neoliberal age, a book from which I got to know her. She also co-published the different brochures, and she's also part of the Council of Migration Studies. Shaping the current debate on race, racism and anti-racism. Alana, a very warm welcome to you.
I hope I understood everything that you said. My German is not excellent.
This is your bio.
Thank you. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, otherwise known as Sydney, Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and mention that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to thank the organisers, in particular Reem Spielhaus and Vasilis Tsianos, for their invitation to speak today. And I've been told to be brief, so I will be as brief as I can. And I'm going to read my text just to make that easier for everybody. So the title of my talk today is Anti-Racism Proxies. It was during the dispossession of Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem last May that I snapped. I wrote, "As a Jew" is a phrase I wish to never hear again in relation to Palestine. Not only was I tired of the Zionist manipulation of biblical mythology to justify the violent occupation of another people's land, but I was also tired of the constant appeal to the so-called Jewish tradition to legitimize anti-Zionist Jews who support Palestinian liberation like myself. Despite this, I constantly find myself interpolated as a Jew. And as a result, I want to begin this talk by telling you that I am feeling uncomfortable. It means something to me to be speaking to an audience in Germany, where over recent years particularly, speaking, acting, or even just living and breathing as a Jew means being constructed as almost otherworldly, or, as I have put it in my book, Why Race Still Matters, as hyperhuman. At the same time, those racialized as other than white are seen as not quite human and forever alien. Race, as Alexander Wehelia has written, is precisely about dividing the human from the not quite human and the non-human who are governed and exploited on this basis. I share in the thinking of the organizers of this conference that, as they say in the program, the use of the term racism is shaped by historical knowledge of National Socialism, which often makes it difficult for the analytical category of racism to be used to examine contemporary relations. I've made this point myself many times in my work, and I presume this is why I've been asked to speak to you today. But I note that in the program, the organizers prefer to speak about racism rather than about race itself. My view is that it is vital to talk about race and not just racism. I do not agree with Ta-Nehisi Coates that, quote, race is the child of racism, not the father. Race doesn't refer only to the invention of bioracial categories by ideological racists. It is in fact much better understood as a complex of ideas and practices that cohere as a system of power and a technology of rule. The aim of racializing power is the production, reproduction, and maintenance of white supremacy on a global scale. It produces the divide between Europeanness and non-Europeanness as central to the modern world order, the global color line that distinguishes the deserving from those put to service them, those undeserving of life and wealth. Race is colonially constituted, as Barner Hesse puts it, and therefore it cannot be detached from its locus of material production on the plantation, at the borders, and in terms of my remarks today, in the ongoing settler colonialism of Israel. As someone who was born on occupied Palestinian land and who self-describes as Jewish European, the Jewish being primary, I feel uncomfortable today because it is the precise conditions created by current material racial arrangements that make my voice hearable at this conference when that of others perhaps is not. I hope I can say what I want to say about the uses and abuses of anti-Semitism today in a way that someone who is differently racialized, especially someone who is Palestinian, Muslim, or a person of color, even when they are experts of anti-Semitism, race, and colonialism, cannot. One scholar I am thinking of in particular is Dr. Anna Esther Yunus, whose research on what she calls the war on anti-Semitism in Germany has been exemplary to me. In my comments today, I wish to build on the 4th chapter of my book, which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew. In it, I look at how anti-Semitism has been made exceptional and why I think that that is bad for anti-racism. I'm motivated by two things. First, the increasing attacks on pro-Palestinian activists, academics, and artists in the name of the opposition to anti-Semitism. In Germany, several high-profile cases have made the news, such as that of Achille Mbembe, Brian Eno, and Mehdi El Hassan. But there are also many less known or unknown Palestinian academics, activists, and others whose freedom of speech and consequently their livelihoods are being threatened by the war on anti-Semitism in Germany. On a smaller scale, I had the experience recently of a few lines that I had written on white supremacy in relation to Israel and the occupation of Palestine being requested to be removed from an article that I had been asked to contribute to an edited book on decoloniality and post-colonialism in German by German scholars. In her review in the recent Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium on my book, Yunus comments on, quote, the concerning trend among certain white Germans to establish themselves as more Jewish than the Jews themselves, or at least as the gatekeepers, I suppose, of what passes as acceptable speech on Jews and anti-Semitism. These attacks and cancellations are not just happening in Germany, as could be seen in the recent decision of the University of Glasgow to disinvite the scholar Somdeep Sen to speak about his book, Decolonizing Palestine. This is due to the worrying adoption of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism by many universities. The European Parliament, as well as several states and cities, have also endorsed it. Even its author, Kenneth Stern, now admits that it runs the risk of being, as he puts it, weaponized to suppress rather than answer political speech. But just last month, it was endorsed by the Australian government. The second motivation for my talk is the fact that anti-Semitism is on the increase. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to an unleashing of anti-Semitic conspiracism. The perverse use of Holocaust imagery to protest COVID restrictions is rife. Jews have a real reason to be afraid. However, I don't think that making anti-Semitism exceptional helps either in the struggle against it or for anti-racism in general, especially now when we are witnessing a deepening of fascist politics. So while thinking about the growth of anti-Semitism, I'm interested in thinking about how I, as a white Jewish European woman who was born on Palestinian land and who currently lives on the still colonized land of the Gadigal people, can act against it from an anti-colonial standpoint. I do not see that fight as separate, different, or more important than the struggle against racism in general. My argument is that the anti-Semitism of mainstream institutions, including most politicians, media figures, and the official Jewish community, has been turned into a proxy for anti-racism. As I wrote in my book, in the present moment, publicly performing opposition to anti-Semitism and support for Israel, the two having been made equivalent, has become a proxy for politicians and public figures' commitment to anti-racism. But at times like this, I must say that I myself feel like a proxy. The fact that I can be heard, but that others can't, is, I think, a problem at the heart of European anti-racism, including the struggle against anti-Semitism itself. Some of the most far right-wing politicians and public figures, from the AfD to Orban, dangerously mobilize both anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism, all, of course, with the imprimatur of Israel and the mainstream Jewish community, because of their shared Zionism and Islamophobia. This has real-life, violent repercussions for Jewish people. Today, Shoah remembrance as a public ritual and civic duty has, I think, eclipsed knowledge of the real history of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been reduced to the Shoah, which itself is reduced to a unique and aberrant event. There is little to no public understanding of the function that the Jew, like the Muslim, the Roma, and the Black, had historically for the racial formation of Europe. Constructing the Shoah as unique and anti-Semitism as exceptional is central to how the official history of Europe is narrated. To place the Shoah in the context of a past and continuous present of race, as intrinsic to the formation of colonial modernity and white European supremacy, as some scholars of genocide, such as Zoe Samudzi, are arguing, would mean a real reckoning with its meaning for Europe and the West. Instead, the Shoah is secured firmly in the past. It thus becomes a prototype for racism to which all other instances can be compared and often found lacking. As I wrote in my book, official top-down anti-racism sets anti-Semitism up as the threat to end all threats, with the purpose not of ending anti-Semitism, but of denying all other racisms within the racial state. In the public discourse, race and racism are not discussed as central to the history of Europe, essential to the development and spread of capitalism, or as a central technology of colonial rule. By detaching race from the facts of history and of the present day in this way, it is then reattached to racialized people who are now seen as the so-called new racists, Black, brown, and especially Muslim people. The racism of those of migrant origin in Europe is said to flow through their failure to integrate into the societies of their so-called hosts, and their temerity to protest in what people think is the wrong way against the discrimination and exploitation that they face. For example, protests against the Israeli ambassador's speech in London on November the 10th were likened to Kristallnacht, merely because the event took place on its anniversary. Although the protest was peaceful, the UK Home Secretary Priti Patel, who has opposed the right to seek asylum, tweeted that anti-Semitism has no place in Britain, thus connecting a protest against one of the most ardent proponents of Israeli colonialism, who opposes interracial marriage and denies the Nakba, with anti-Semitism faced by British Jews. But it would be a mistake to conclude that the recitation of objection to anti-Semitism translates into actual concern for Jews. The hypocrisy of those who claim to care about Jews while enacting racist policy is not an error, it is by design. But of course, pointing out hypocrisy is a distraction. In general, racism is filled with double standards. Once we stop dwelling on that and understand the particular political function of a fixation with Jews and anti-Semitism today, then we can start to undo the harm done to anti-racism. In this regard, philo-Semitism, which is a false love for Jews, plays an important role in the exceptionalization of anti-Semitism. Philo-Semitism, while nominally protecting Jews, always casts us as outsiders and borders on the obsessional. Houria Boutelja theorizes a state philo-Semitism, which functions to deny any discussion of racism. Anti-Semitism is responded to by exaggerated philo-Semitic attitudes by which Jews are once again transformed into ethereal creatures, the mirror image of the anti-Semitic caricature. State philo-Semitism emerged when Europeans realized that it had applied colonialist procedures on its own soil, as Aimé Césaire famously put it, in relation to Europe's reckoning with Nazism and the Shoah. Decontextualized and depoliticized, anti-Semitism and the Shoah have been recast as a trauma at the heart of whiteness, and in Germany, at the heart of the nation. If philo-Semitism meant actual love for Jews, then of course it would include anti-Zionist Jews, Black Jews, and Jews of color, and all those who do not fit into a template of what the modern Jewish subject of the post-Holocaust is supposed to look like. As the French Jewish anti-colonialist Simon Assoun writes, state philo-Semitism takes independent agency away from Jews and squeezes us between the forces of power and the popular masses. State philo-Semitism and the war on anti-Semitism have been used to justify repressive measures such as the recent French law against separatism. The law, as you probably know, allows for anyone who disrespects the values of the French Republic, naming radical Islamism in particular, to be imprisoned for 3 years or face a fine of 45,000 euros. For President Emmanuel Macron and his supporters, the law is necessary due to the failure, as he sees it, of integration and of, quote, our fight against discrimination and racism, such as anti-Semitism, which have bred our enemy. Here, Macron singles anti-Semitism out among racisms and claims that it was the failure to act against it which created the conditions for the assassination of the school teacher Samuel Paty, who himself was not Jewish. The Frantz Fanon Foundation said about the law that it is a new demonstration of the coloniality of power, targeting racialized communities already disproportionately policed and punished. By setting Jews up as a community to be defended from separatist Muslims, the law drives a further wedge between Jews and other racialized people with whom I think we should be in solidarity against both state and popular racisms. So we can see that the fight against anti-Semitism acts as a proxy for a real opposition to racism, with even right-wing actors able to portray themselves as the true anti-racists because of their performative opposition to anti-Semitism. Concern with anti-Semitism, seen as equivalent to anti-Zionism and associated with Muslim minorities and decolonial activists and thinkers, rather than with the European elites with whom it originates, is used to justify repressive state action against racialized communities and to whitewash state racism. On the one hand, anti-Semitism has become a tool with which to disarm political opposition from the left. On the other, anti-Semitism is a mere weapon whose mention automatically triggers distrust. This was the simplistic binary presented in the so-called anti-Semitism crisis in the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. For those who wanted to defend Corbyn, this was seen as more important than the principles of anti-racism, and any existence of anti-Semitism was automatically dismissed as weaponization rather than being looked at in its own right. But many on the other side who saw the Labour Party as rife with anti-Semitism, often didn't have the concerns of actual Jews at heart. This reminds me that Jews, both for anti-Semites and for those who manipulate anti-Semitism for other than anti-racist ends, are what David Smith has called ghostly walking tropes. They are representations of people, not people per se. The swing then between the outright dismissal of anti-Semitism and its manipulation in the interests of states or political actors is of no service to me, a Jewish person. The constant attack and counterattack in the war on anti-Semitism leads to us getting caught in the question of whether anti-Semitism is real or an imaginary weapon. Turning anti-Semitism into a matter for debate has detrimental effects on both Jews ourselves and on the potential to build solidarities with other people. In fact, this debate is not about anti-Semitism or racism at all. Rather, it is a proxy through which those within institutions struggle over power. The question should not be, does anti-Semitism exist, or is it more or less threatening than other forms of racism? Anti-Semitism exists because the extent to which it is a core ideology at the heart of Euro-modernity has not been confronted, just as there is a general refusal to confront race as an ongoing political force. The very posing of such questions from either side of the political divide serves as a way to avoid confronting the effects of race, coloniality, and racism at both the local and the global level. So where does this leave us? And I'm coming to the end. In my book, I argue that there are two types of anti-Semitism, good and bad, just as there are two types of Jews, both good and bad. Bad anti-Semitism is presented as real. It exists among the far right, the far left, and Muslims. In contrast, good anti-Semitism, which treats Jews as a racialized subaltern group in service to the state, is left unchallenged. Bad Jews are those who refuse to allow anti-Semitism to be instrumentalized in the service of racial rule. We are anti-Zionist and therefore struggle against racism in all its forms. The bad Jew who refuses to sit in her place is the thorn in the side of the racial state. So anti-colonialist Jews acting collectively must work to undermine the role we are assigned under globalized racial rule. I'm enthused by Santiago Slobodski's call in his book Decolonial Judaism for Jews to return to what he provocatively calls our barbarian roots, the roots that attach us to other racially exploited peoples. Although white Jews, such as myself, cannot merely deny the role that we play in structural whiteness and Euro-American hegemony, as M. Cohen has pointed out, we can and must align ourselves with the anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle and refuse to participate in whitewashing attacks on anti-colonial resistance in the false name of protecting Jews. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Thanks. I love your British pronunciation. Great. We will make progress now with the presentation of Eddie Bruce Jones. Welcome, Eddie. Ein paar Wörter zur Debüt von Kollegen Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones. Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones ist auch
He is not only here as a representative of the School of Law at Birkbeck College, where he's a legal academic and anthropologist. He is also part of the activist scene and well known in this regard. He is the author of State Violence and Contemporary Law with a view of Germany, and in the area of human rights, he has also made a number of publications. He was an academic fellow and associate member of the Administrative Council of in the UK and of the Rainbow Education Authority for Intersectionality, headquartered in Berlin. He has already been a consultant to many different organizations, for example, the UNHCR, as well as the Committee for Equality of the European Council. He is part of different publication companies and consultant. Eddie, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Vasilis, and thank you to the organizers. And thank you to my colleague, Alana Lenton, for being awake in the middle of the night in where you're calling from. So that's on Gadigal land. And thank you for informing us and educating us. I'm going to be pretty brief because I think my comments will really ask some questions that hopefully will come out in the conversation. And I took the opportunity to really think about the body in a way that I don't think or maybe even lots of researchers don't tend to do in a direct way, because we assume that race and racism have a lot to do with the body, but don't maybe think through in a programmatic way of what that means and how to think about the body within race and racism, although we probably do it just all the time without thinking theoretically about it. So the concept of the body, in particular how the body and race interact, lends itself to a vast body of literature across disciplines and various schools of thought and experience. But thinking about the way my own research intersects with this question, I'll be reflecting on a few issues and episodes from my research in Germany, but also from the UK context. So I'll read a bit and I'll comment a bit while I go. So the body is unquestionably a central organizing feature of race as a set of practices and concepts. And I like what Alana Lenton said about it also being about race as a conceptual idea, and not only that racism is kind of the framing aspect, but race as a set of practices. I really think that's important. One can argue that to the extent that racism and race are culturally and socially embedded, race sets up a system of hierarchies that classifies and codes and orders human beings. The body, or at least some projection of what the body is, has to be a principal feature of processes of racialization in some way. So even today, where contemporary racism is not expressed only or even primarily as an issue of biology, cultural and social forms of racism incorporate a wide range of concepts, and some of these include performative and contextual clues. But that also means that the body isn't only about biology anyway. But then on top of that, there is this aspect of biological racism that comes into the discourse of social forms of race and racism. So effectively, it's not a matter of whether the body is a central component of racialization, but how and to what effect. And I wanted to just raise 4 points for the panel to consider as kind of one of the opening panels of the conference. The first point is about the body's particularity and the notion that various types of racism don't have a symmetrical relationship to the body with regard to racialized communities. But that doesn't mean that it's not an appropriate organizing frame just because there's not, there's not some symmetry or an identical relationship of different experiences to this concept or to the body. The second point is about exceptionalism. And by that, I mean logics that determine racism's contours are both locally and historically contingent. And it's important to recognize them as connected inflections of racism. So to see them relationally, rather than comparing them as decoupled and separate systems of race and racism. because that allows us to then think of some locations as having an exceptional format of racism that should then be seen in isolation and not connected to the other forms of racism. I think it's kind of a different way of thinking of something like intersectionality or something like the composite forms of oppression that exist, that there is a way of thinking of the connectivities between different forms of racism as actually inflections of a common system. Third is a point about authority. And in the current context, it refers to this very difficult discursive debate around who can decide what racism is as a matter of law and policy, and how the politics of diversity can be instrumentalized to deny the existence of racism. And maybe that's an obvious point, but it's one that's so tactical and it's so apparent to many of us, but really is a successful type of denial program. So I think it's still really important to be clear that diversity, because it's still such an important catchphrase institutionally, that diversity politics can be used to deny the existence of racism. And that has everything to do with bodies and who is where and what representation looks like versus what real anti-racist work is. And then the fourth is a point about knowledge, and in particular, the idea that there's knowledge invested in the body, and that the body isn't just a side feature that is instrumentalized by racism, but rather there are ways of thinking about the body and our relationships to our bodies that has a lot to do with how we see history and time and ancestry and the relationship between our lived experience and the long history that we will have if we have this connection to where we've come from, this long history that we have with racism and colonial logics, that really is important to not discount the idea of ancestral memory and the relationship that our bodies have with history and time. So those are the four main points, and I'll just kind of go through them quickly before closing, just with a bit more detail. So the particularity of the body, for me, working on anti-Black racism in most of my research, and mostly looking at Europe, but a bit looking at colonialism, British colonialism in particular, in India and the Caribbean, it's almost impossible for me to conceive of racism in my own research without looking at the body and how tropes of racism play themselves out using those physical aspects in order to work. So for me, the body enters the frame in different ways, though, when we're thinking about anti-Black racism, as they might with, anti-Semitism. And I like what Alana Lenton was saying about the positioning of oneself as a white Jewish person may have a different relationship with certain forms of the uses of race or racialization. But that anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islam, racism against Roma, and other forms of racism don't need to look identical in the way that they are positioned with regard to either the body or to race, but they can still be seen as being part of a set of logics and enactments and practices that use and play on one another in order to be successful in some ways. So it's not to say that they're all variations of a singular type of race that needs to be combated with a singular strategy of anti-racism. Sometimes they're used against one another, or they're used in conjunction with one another. So I think that's important because it will make it difficult, if we think that way, it'll make it difficult to deny certain types of racism as either less important or not racism at all. Because I think that's also a danger of seeing certain things as racism, but then other things as not really fitting the hegemonic idea of what racism means. and therefore discounted from being a part of this network, this circuitry of race and racism. I've been deeply involved with the case of the death of Uri Jallo in the German context, and there the body is so central that it's almost, too obvious to talk about the body in that case. But it was a case, of course, where a Sierra Leonean man who was arrested in the middle of the night for, asking people to use a cell phone, was then put in 4-point restraints, and he was burned to death. And so the question was whether he burned himself or whether the police took part. The courts have decided over the years that the police haven't taken part, but they didn't ask the question of whether the police were involved. They assumed that it was a suicide. And part of the reason that that assumption had traction in the court, in my view, having observed the trial, is that the trope of an asylum applicant who is desperate and is from Sierra Leone, doesn't have a support network, might have been drinking or having taken some drugs, in the middle of the night is arrested. It's obvious that he was desperate and he was in a bad way and killed himself. That narrative is the one that I think was pitched to the general public for many years, and it's the one that basically held the ground in court. And everyone asked the question, if he looked differently, or if he were in a different position, if he were a white German citizen, would this have happened? Would that narrative have been, would it have had any traction? And so in this particular case, race, and very particularly the trope around this person's body, was so central that it became kind of, this big question of whether this is even possible to conceive of if the circumstances were just even a bit different. I could talk all day about this particular case and the other ways that the body was relevant, but of course it has everything to do as well with the turning the victim into the criminal, which is kind of the main trope that we're seeing happen again and again in various contexts in the context of criminal law. From a policy perspective, race is an important analytical frame here for the body and social experience, because without the concept of race, it's not very easy or effective to translate social experience into categories that are protected under law. Ethnicity doesn't always do the work that it does to think about racialization in a broader way. Language or cultural background, or in Germany, the term migration background, Migrationshintergrund, doesn't recognize all the various ways in which people who are racialized as non-white might not have a migration background in the same sense as someone who's newly migrated to Germany, but will nonetheless suffer racial discrimination. Ethnicity doesn't really provide a good proxy for race, because it doesn't necessarily speak to people's experiences, neither does language. So the question of race as an analytical category and whether to keep it in law and policy is a big one. Part of the question there is how to think about racial data, which all across Europe is typically not collected. So how to prove, if you will, racial, patterns of racial discrimination and effects of institutional racism without a sense of the statistical data on one hand. On the other hand, of course, there's much room to be skeptical about the state and its collection of DNA, biometric information, as Vasilis mentioned, and this general culture of a forensic surveillance operation that will most likely impact people of color and people who are marginalized and criminalized in a much sharper way. So this dilemma, I think, is one that that European people who are resident in Europe, really in general, will need to face in the coming years. But we see a lot of activity by different states in Europe to try to kind of water down or eliminate this concept of race as an analytical category that I think is quite dangerous for helping us. It's dangerous because it makes it difficult to identify patterns of racism. I know I should keep this short, so I'm just going to mention one thing for the other points. On the exceptionalism point, I think it's just really important to think about these various forms of racism as connected rather than as separate. As I mentioned, Thomas Kruger in the opening for this conference mentioned that there are local dimensions of race and racism that make a huge difference in how race is experienced and how it's operationalized. But that, I guess, the counterpoint or the but point there is that there is maybe not a perfect way to think about the global patterns of racism and these global ideas that don't translate identically, but are really important to think about in a broader transnational context, because the ideas do flow. There are shared histories of race and colonialism, and the experiences that are being shared are also quite clear. But they don't need to be shared in some very specific, historically contingent way to be part of the logics and tactics and circuitry that are currently, framing our global world. Whether it's, police being trained in the U.S. and in Israel, for example, the police services sharing tactics on how to control certain communities, or like we saw with G4S in the UK, which is a private security service, having links in other countries to share techniques on how to operationalize large prison services or security services. That has to do also with logics of controlling certain groups of people and how to operationalize that within the state. So, and quickly, the third point on authority, I just wanted to mention one example of how certain types of diversity are used in the service of denying racism. In the UK, there was this commission by the government recently called the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparity that many understood would then create a discussion around institutional racism. But it was commissioned by the conservative government, where it was virtually all people of color who were brought together to write this long report on institutional racism. And they came out and basically said institutional racism is, it doesn't really exist. That term is used way too broadly. There isn't very much of it anymore. And really the issue is getting people to overcome their own, deficits. So it uses this model of making people who don't have access potentially to certain institutions, that they're the problem, that they need to overcome certain deficits in order to compete. And that just because there's an impact on certain groups doesn't mean that that's racism. It just means that there are other things like class that we should focus on. So it removes the analysis from one that's about race and racism to one that's about class, which is a very old tactic. But I think it's important there that it's done in the context of, first of all, putting people of color in a position where they're being instrumentalized in order to capitalize on their bodies. I mean, for lack of a better explanation of how to say this, the diversity of representation becomes there a technique of the political power to try to combat critiques of the state. And it was very obvious. I mean, I have a colleague, Nadine Elanani, who wrote a book called Empire's Endgame, where they kind of predict this type of behavior. And it's a really great way to see how race is used in the service of protecting state interests in racism. And finally, this point about knowledge, just to think about ways in which the body holds this knowledge that's intergenerational and how diasporic formations of different types, so that reflect people's relationship to movement, so migration, but also to their ancestors and to the idea that the body is actually something that people retain across generations. So the relationship between the body and the environment, and this idea of having a relationship to time and history that doesn't lock history away in some untouchable realm where it has no bearing on the present, but that the past is a part of the present. I mean, that has maybe less to do with the body than to do with the epistemology of the legacy of historical experience, and in particular, historical violence. But that is conveyed through this idea of the body, or even the haptic or the sensory, but maybe not physical form of being able to sense ancestors and sense the past. As a law academic, that may not be the easiest thing to convey in a legal context, but thinking more broadly about anti-racism, it really is important, because that shows some of the contributions of how to think about race and racism as connected temporally to historical forms of violence in a very immediate way. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Let's try to present the next comment. Noah, did you have the little bios, please?
Yes, hello. Now I take over. I don't know what you see out there. Yeah, now I see there's another screen. So after we had these two inputs, a larger lecture by Alana, and then also another ad by Eddie. And now we have two more commentaries by Nasira Gunef and Piro Reshepi. And I will briefly introduce them because I just recently came in, and I will do it in English. And I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Okay, because I got an information not everybody could hear me. But I continue. So it's an honor to introduce you to, wait, I need to look at the document, to Nasira Gunef, and she's an anthropologist and sociologist, author and editor of 4 books examining structural racism in France. The book is Disparity aux descendants d'immigrants nord-africains from 2000, Disparity from 2003, Les féministes et les garçons arabes with Eric Massé et Lope from 2004, and as an editor of La République mise en nu par son immigration. She has also broadly published in other outlets, and I'm happy to have you here. And please give your commentary, and after that I will introduce you to Piro. It's your floors.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join this most interesting panel, and for having us, despite the conditions in all Europe, actually. unlike Alana Lantin, there's no reference to any kind of people that Paris is erasing from its perspective, but I rather would want to start this talk by referring to the suburban experience that people beyond Paris are experiencing, especially with regard to police violence and to state racism that has become a major point. And especially going back to what was just mentioned, I would want to refer also to the fact that a way to diminish the positions of academics in France is not only led by the separatist law that was mentioned by Alana Lantin, but also by a campaign that was launched by the president and is ongoing, trying to target and to identify among academics Islamo-gauchists, Islamo-leftists, and that is doing a lot of harm to all of us, including me. I will get back to that. So my remarks will be stemming from a question that was mentioned by Rim Spielhaus when she wrote to us, and that can be defined this way, and what it is that more people should know about racism, and I will stem from that in my remarks. My first answer would be that racism kills, and that its core principle, race understood as a system, a systemic racism, can be dressed up as the major argument in favor of the patriotic defense of a nation, of a culture, an identity declared and presented as under threat from the growing presence of migrants, Islam, so-called crossbreeding that became an international call for fighting the Great Replacement, a French contribution to an identitarian international, my term, if I may. This is what parties like the AfD, I think you mentioned that in your opening remarks, in Germany, and the recast National Front in France, and many others across Europe and beyond, are selling to their partisans, constituents, and their electorship. But let's not remain in the comfort zone of blaming it on these extreme rights or far rights, parties or organizations, or even the broader society only. Such stance clears ourselves as academics from examining the complacence or blinding towards the internal conjunctures of racism in the European academia. And I include my institution, my country, France, and myself. I'll let you decide for yourselves in that respect. As scholars and activists, for some of us, we have become aware a long time and across centuries to the male gaze that prevents from dismantling the patriarchal structures of social formations that for some of them yet define themselves as democratic, respectful of human rights, and anti-sexist, something I coined some years ago in an article as a patriarchal anti-sexism. This is still a long way to go yet to reach this goal. As scholars and activists, for some of us, we have become aware of the white gaze and the damages that has caused across centuries as it conveyed the belief in the European Christian superiority on others, so-called races, people, ethnies, and eventually forced migrants and illegally mobile humans crossing borders, among which people from former colonies are viewed as the quintessential threat to the European survival. To the end of such understanding more of the colonial roots of the Europe invention, the examination, for example, by Hansen and Johnson of a repressed past and present coloniality, namely Euro-Africa, is most useful and can be a starting point to further dismantle the white gaze and more so the white male gaze. This intersectional gaze dwells quite easily in the academia and stems from a self-entitlement and a sense of innocence that we have no right to keep on reclaiming, as our institutions can be failed, just as can be political parties, civil organizations, in times when an identitarian international fed by a nostalgia of the past grandeur, moral panic, is striking back and becomes all too pervasive, while its toxic ideology reaches new heights. We no longer can look the other way, while decisions are being made under the pretense of scientific objectivity, positivism, or methodologic nationalism, to not hire, prevent research from being led, positions to be opened, or to disinvite from a conference certain persons that are framed as non-scientific, too militant, especially with relation to the BDS academic campaign, or using notions such as Islamophobia, or again, theoretical frameworks such as that are currently under attack in Europe, the US and beyond, such as gender theories, feminist theories, post-decolonial studies, critical race theory, ethnic and racial studies, etc. And to just mention the example that was given earlier by Alana Lantin, obviously this is one of the tricks that made Anna Yunus in such a position to never be able to practice her research in Germany. But we could go to other examples. I was disinvited some years ago by German colleagues who defined themselves as being racialized among the German academia because, and here I quote, I was too close to movements that were in favor of Palestine, and therefore I was framed as anti-Semite in Germany and among certain intellectual and academic circles. France, the UK, and Germany, as well as other European countries, are not just the illiberal ones we have in mind as we gather right here and right now, are no exception to these alarming trends. And because this is not addressed, some academics or independent scholars left in precarious situation in many European countries are facing harassment and silencing, are prevented from contributing to knowledge production and offer their skills in classrooms and research centers by moral entrepreneurs, or should we see and study them as identitarian entrepreneurs, part of what I suggested to call an identitarian international. But more concerning, they face silencing and harassment from fellow academics, including some that run highly respected institutions in their institutions or the institutions they try to join by applying for positions and for research programs. Such concerning situation is for us as academics to address if we do not want to be caught in what I view as the damaging effect of an academic gaze, understood in the line of the male gaze and the white gaze, we all want to distance ourselves from, as we may know better since we read Gilroy, Wecker, Hall, Fanon, Harding, Lord, Pereira da Silva, and many, many more. This academic gaze, I suggest to put at work during our conversation today and beyond, is quite the opposite of what we aim at achieving as an intellectual community and what we entertain ourselves as being spared from. Yet, it is happening right here and right now as we pretend to be virtuous and consistent with our values and commitment to knowledge production and dissemination among all venues of the societies we belong to and interact with. The reason why this type of gaze is so effective and damaging is because innocence is still all too pervasive as a tool of self-representation in our institution and in our minds. We remain convinced that this is not our duty to tackle race and racism inside because it is not our fault, inside our institutions. We are all about being racist. It is not for us to make that effort, but rather for those who are overtly racist and should be condemned and educated by us, actually, in order to escape their racist view of the world and their neighbors. The racist is the other, outside academia. Well, we should know better. How are we to reach this goal of dismantling the academic gaze and its damaging effects, since we may righteously view it as an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms? Academia is the site of, if we are able to admit that we are part of the problem and that being part of the solution requires that we come to terms with this preliminary observation of how the academic gaze operates in the face of racist acts, undercover racism, and race relations. By denying the fact, by sugarcoating it with other reasons and causalities, we leave the cover on the well, to quote an old popular Arab saying. Flawless institutions, or at least institutions that aim at flawlessness, are in a better position to profess a critical knowledge teaching on race and racism if they apply their lens on measuring biases, prejudice, and asymmetrical perceptions inside as well as outside. An institution that makes space for or turns a blind eye on its internal racializations or faculty, students, topics, and interaction is in no position to address such major questions as race and racism in today's Europe. Academic and ethical challenges are no different than political challenges faced by states, organizations, or institutions. Even more so in times of a completed neoliberalizations of all segments of the global North and South, and thus of higher education and research institutions in democratic societies that weaken the checks and balances they can apply internally and externally as they embrace the difficult and urgent task of describing, monitoring, and contributing to eradicating racism and its race systemic foundations, which they are encountered and are to be tackled. So for that purpose, and I will finish with that, embodiment of racism, of an academic gaze on race and races, is our duty right now and our task. We embody as human beings and academics a possibility to overcome the way race is embodied and addressed inside our institutions and in the societies at large. And this may begin by dwelling at the border as a body border, as I suggested in some older writing, and making us as the tool and the compass of fighting racism and race inside and outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. We have another comment now by Piro Recipe. I'm happy to introduce you to him. He will give the final comment, and then we will have a discussion here among the panelists. Piro Recipe holds a PhD in politics from the University of Strathclyde. His research focuses on decoloniality, sexuality, and Islam. His recent work on racism and borders along the Balkan refugee route has been published in a range of mediums in and out of academia, including the International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Critical Muslims, and The Guardian, among others. A warm welcome to Piro. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Noah. I feel so humbled to be in the company of Alana, Eddie, Najira, whose works I've obviously read before and am familiar with. I haven't necessarily prepared a presentation because I was told that we would engage with the presentations. And so maybe I would like to start from where Eddie left off on the 4 points that he brought up, namely race, relations, and the body, race in relation to exceptionalism, race and authority, and race and knowledge. And I'd like to start with the exceptionalism point, because I think in as much as European modernity, coloniality, left no part of the world untouched, there is a global framework of whiteness against which race and racialization is defined. But then, yes, there are local forms of how racism operates. And most of the vocabulary on race and racism today and knowledge production comes from generally Western Europe and the United States. And so when you remove yourself from Western academia, what passes for and what knowledge is addressed around race and racialization becomes very complex and complicated. So my work usually looks at post-socialist spaces, and I look at how post-socialist bodies are invited and integrated into the European Union as a way of reinforcing the border and the distinction between the post-colonial and the post-socialist other. So while the post-socialist white body, the Polish body, the Hungarian body, the Croatian body may be integrated into Europeanness or is arranged for integration, that process inevitably goes through a further distinction from the post-colonial black and brown body who appears at the border. And so there's a body element to this, obviously, because there's a self-fashioning of whiteness that happens in this process that is both symbolic but also structural, and that is interrelated to the infrastructural violence on migrant and Roma bodies on the Balkan route. But I think there's also ways in which exceptionalism is used, not just by the far right, which you must all be very familiar with, especially in the Eastern European context, but also by the left, in the sense that anti-racism
We lost you, Piero. At least I did.
Are
Piero, the connection is bad. We're losing you. I think you're back now. Piero, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry, my internet is really bad.
Now it's good. I think we just lost this last minute.
Okay. So in relation to exceptionalism, I wanted to suggest that yes, there's a global framework, and then there's local forms of exceptionalism, especially erasure, whereby various historical trajectories are utilized to produce certain spaces as colorblind. And in the Eastern European context and the post-socialist context that I look at, usually the Cold War emerges as this imaginary where supposedly the Second World was anti-racist and decolonial. And what this narrative does is to salvage some part of socialism as anti-racist and anti-colonial exploitation of the Third World, especially in the non-aligned context. So these local historical trajectories are always important to kind of think alliances, solidarities, and positionalities, not only on the local, but also on the global level. And so the second point that Eddie brought up that I think it's very important is also authority. And so knowledge production in the West is so hegemonic that it's very difficult to challenge, question, or engage with the kind of frameworks that are proposed to think about racialization in relationship to power, in relationship to Euro-American spaces. And so one example, for instance, that I always find fascinating is when people speak of the transatlantic in Western academia, what they usually mean is the transatlantic slave trade that produced global coloniality and capitalism. But when you speak about transatlantic in post-socialist spaces, it has a completely different temporal and spatial connotation. Transatlantic in post-socialist spaces means the post-socialist integration of post-socialist spaces in the Euro-American alliance, meaning integration into the EU, NATO, security and economic structures. And so though this is just one example of how the very notion of terminology does different names and different conceptions. If I'm not sure if I'm arguing that there needs to be a more thorough understanding and engagement with non-Western scholarship on race and racialization, while always bearing in mind that that could be subverted in the sense that many times, for instance, when you bring up racism in non-Western spaces, it's used as an excuse to draw attention away from how race was reinforced by coloniality, modernity, by saying, well, there was race in the Ottoman Empire before the Ottoman Empire was modernized. Well, yes, there may have been various forms of racializations, and there was also slavery. But this doesn't mean that the way we think about embody and the way racism functions today is a product of Western European colonial modernity and capitalism. And so the other point I wanted to address was the race in relation to the body that Eddie brought up. And of course, it's a very difficult or challenging concept to kind of define, but I'll give a quick example of the last work that I published on predatory porn, where I worked with migrant sex workers in Salonika or Thessaloniki in Greece. And so one of the ways in which migrant sex workers, for instance, self-fashion themselves is to produce the kind of desirability that is desired by the client. And this desirability is related to certain notions of modern or pre-modern masculinities or heterosexuality. So the Arab, generally migrant, is presumed to be to embody certain pre-modern, pre-European heterosexuality that hasn't been tainted by metrosexuality. And so this becomes a way of navigating both the infrastructure, the border infrastructure of violence, but also the violence of the, not just what Najir was talking about, the white male patriarchal gaze, but also the white homosexual and homonationalist gaze that utilizes or exploits migrant labor to kind of furnish a certain kind of desire that relates to the border, embodies being at the border. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we decenter race and racism from the West towards its peripheries, what we witness is, of course, a far more crude and a far more violent form of sanctioning and fragmentation of bodies along racial lines, in part because in the even the notion of diversity doesn't exist. And the engagement worked at the Max Planck Institute for Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany for 2 years. And to me, every day was a fascinating example of how diversity was continuously deployed to silence issues, to directly silence issues of race and racism. And generally, these questions were couched in terms of religious diversity and ethnic diversity. And so this terminology is one of the more powerful examples of how structural racism operates to erase and evade questions about race and racism. And so maybe this relates also to the questions that were sent to us about what research do we need to do on conjunctures of racism in Europe. And I think for me personally, it's been, at least in those institutions that I've worked on, it's been a constant struggle to just simply get the institutions to acknowledge the very concept of racism and racialization, and to avoid replacing it with diversity as a nicer and a more polite way of avoiding to engage with questions of racism. I'll stop there, and I hope I can engage and contribute more to the conversation as it evolves. Grateful for being part of the panel again. Thank you.
Great. Let's talk together. I have one general question related to all presentations and comments. And this is the question about the disconnecting of the anti-racistic genealogies in Europe. If we try to understand the ongoing racism today, and this is my experience in Germany, we are confronted with a permanent production of minorities and non-minorities, with a production of permanent minorities in relation to the everyday racism. And this is, I think, related to the disconnection of connected anti-racistic stragglers in the past. The question of anti-Semitism and anti-racism, the bifurcation, the German exceptionalism as bifurcation of anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-Semitism, has also a genealogy of disconnecting stragglers in Germany. And I ask me, what is your experience in your national context? You can speak also, did you have also the same experience of the politics of disconnecting the anti-racistic struggles? I hope you understand me. It was a question.
Who are you asking, Vasilis? Who would you like to answer?
No, we try to discuss together.
What would you like me to decide?
Please, go, Alala. I don't like to decide.
Because there was like a silence. I mean, I think for myself personally, it's not useful to talk about national context because I'm not somebody who, I'm just putting it out there. So I think what we can come together to do as people who think about racism and anti-racism in the European context and elsewhere is to think very much about how all of the things that are being discussed today very usefully by all of the panelists, but also the questions that you raise are part and parcel of what Gavin Titley and I, for example, wrote about in the crises of multiculturalism as the kind of this kind of recited truths, the circulation of ideas, borrowings from here and there, and the kind of repetition, the cyclical repetition of tropes about race. So one example that we gave at the time when we were writing the book, which was very actual, but still hasn't gone away, is the necessity everywhere to have a debate about the hijab. So, you know, France banned the hijab for girls going to school in 2004. And suddenly every small town in Europe had to have a debate about whether, you know, too many women were wearing the veil. And as we pointed out, this was not actually coming from any kind of localized reality, but it was really a kind of a borrowing of a moral panic about race that then became relevant or was made or squeezed into being relevant in the local case. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of the splitting, I think this is what you were saying, the sort of splitting of anti-racism, and I think also the hegemony of the framework of diversity that both Eddie and Piero spoke about, it contributes to the ease with which these types of moral panics become anchored and then become kind of truths, you know, recited truths in the way that we wrote about it. Because there is this notion which serves, of course, the structures of systemic racism and state power, racializing power, coloniality, etc. It serves that locus, whatever that assemblage is, right, to think about us as differently racialized people pitted against each other with competing interests, rather than part of people who are responding to existing in, interpolated by this complex assemblage of racialization that, as Eddie rightly said, is distinct, right? So anti-Black racism is definitely not the same as anti-Semitism, definitely not the same as anti-Roma racism, etc. But these are relational in the sense that they are all put, you know, in the service of, as I said, you know, maintaining and reproducing constantly global white supremacy, which I think, as Piero interestingly showed, is also now extended to areas of Europe which were once considered very much beyond the pale when it came to the construction of what Europeanness was about, which is, of course, as I said, is central to the construction of race. So to bring it to a close, I think it's very convenient to you know, mount, you know, something that's very actual at the moment over the last few years, this idea that identity politics has kind of taken over everything, and the people are splintered into these groups that disagree with each other fundamentally, and that something like intra-communitarian racism, to kind of use that language, which not my own language, but the kind of language that you hear out there, is more prevalent or more important or has overtaken old racism, right? Old racism of the white, of you know, white Europeans, etc., which of course again serves racializing power. So I think we need to be really, really wary of this, while also noting how certain groups who are hegemonic in the spaces of diversity entrepreneurship also mobilize and manipulate this discourse to their own ends. And so not to be naive also about how certain negatively racialized actors, I'm thinking of my own, you know, some of the stuff I spoke about, how the mainstream Jewish community, you know, manipulates the weaponization of anti-Semitism idea for its own ends in the service of a settler colonial state. So we shouldn't be naive about, you know, the participation of racialized people in this dangerous enterprise that takes us away from solidarity building.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up. I mean, that really resonates with me, Alana, and I just want to maybe come at this from a more of the angle of looking at how political debates in the UK right now give the local inflection here really shows how struggles that have been hard fought for decades by different communities are then sometimes recast in the service of the state saying racism isn't so bad, and kind of re-engaged with historically in a way that I think is really quite disingenuous and misleading. So there's this term in the UK that's been used for decades, which is Black and minority ethnic. And that term is supposed to more or less be a proxy for people of color generally in the way that it's used in the UK. And I think that's been used, well, it's been used because before that, Black was used as a term that meant people of color, and it's referred to today as political Blackness. But there are a lot of problems that have been cited, you know, including by communities of color, that term, it shouldn't be used as a catch-all phrase. So many people, you know, have different opinions about this. But in the context of scrutiny of this term, Black and minority ethnic, this commission that I mentioned earlier that the government put into place to look at discrimination argued that Black and minority ethnic should not be used because when you use it, you overstate the impacts of racism. Because Black minority ethnic as a term, of course, helps us identify the differences that people experience if they're non-white versus if they're white in the labor market, in education, in access to services, all kinds of things. But the point of the commission was to say, well, we need to break it down even more because then we'll see that there are groups of people of color who are doing really well. And that means that it can't be an issue of structural racism if there are certain groups that are racialized that are actually succeeding. And it means that we need to look at those groups that aren't succeeding and see what their problems are. And then it shifts the gaze to them rather than to structures of whiteness. So it basically removes the scrutiny around whiteness. And so, I mean, it's problematic, of course, but it shows how we really need to have a narrative and a clear sense of how communities do work together. Because historically in the UK, communities of people of color have been working together for decades and decades in the UK to try to combat racism. So it is important to kind of, to really make public history accessible to people and to get those narratives right, because there's a lot politically at stake to doing that.
Maybe just to follow up and be brief, I clearly agree with what was just said. I think that in that respect, not to say that France is an interesting case, because the notion of pitting victims one against the other, the victims of history, for example, is something that is very much used in the public debates in order to dismiss any kind of claims regarding the respect of fundamental rights, and also a way to maybe conjure the fact that actually minorities are working together. And I completely agree with what you just said, Eddie, about the British case. I think it's the case also in France, and it's more and more the case. And yet, political powers and pundits decide to describe France as some sort of a theater of division, a theater of conflict between minorities. This was also something that was said during the 2005 revolts in the suburban housing project. It was said that it was a competition, you know, people were competing with one another, which was not the case at all. So there's this kind of alternative narrative that is being promoted in France about the fact that the more you speak about racism, and the more you raise the question of race, the more you are likely to become a racist instead of being an anti-racist, which is completely counterintuitive, but it works quite well in France right now. So I would rather suggest that since we understand that race is relational, and this is how it functions mainly, that would be interesting to move beyond national borders in order to understand how this plays out across Europe, in Euro-Africa, in Euro-America, all these connections that have to be made and to be highlighted in order to downplay and to propose some counter narratives to what is just happening. And this also relies not just on history, but also on social sciences to be more decentered from their innocence, as I was just saying, so that there's a real matter of understanding of how, not being accomplices with what states or official organizations or commissions are brought to say, but rather to propose analyses and knowledge that really challenge this way, these views and the effects, the political and social effects of these views.
Maybe I can add a regional example to this. So for instance, the way in which this manifests itself in Eastern Europe or along the Balkan route is, for instance, pitting, let's say, the plea of the migrants stuck at the border with the austerity measures of the Greek state. And so what became most prominent in academic and policy circles as a framework of conversation was the austerity measures that the Greek population was suffering. And meanwhile, Greece was actively involved in buying drone programs developed in Gaza by Israel to police its borders for migrants, and migrants dying on Greek borders. So, and mind you, this is all at the time when Greece was under the government of Syriza, which is ostensibly, or at least when it was elected, it was considered as the future of leftist politics and anti-racist politics. And so I think there's also a larger continental or European-wide ways in which, or let's call them geopolitical ways in which various issues are deployed to hide or not necessarily, or silence more structural forms of violence that happen under the critique of neoliberalism and austerity measures. And so, I mean, this is, I'm using Greece as an example, but it could be used as an example throughout the rest of the countries along the route, whereby Bosnians, Serbs, Macedonians generally, left or right, would project themselves as the real victims and not the refugees, which their state infrastructure is actively targeting for death and damage.
Thank you for all your input. First of all, I have a question, but before I want to address the question, I'm really honored to have you all here because it's really enriching with all your inputs and your perspectives. And you have addressed several points and the relations of racism and anti-Semitism and making clear that there is an interconnection. What I'm addressing here is in particular because I could consider you all as very different, that you all four embody different perspectives, but there is one similar embodiment as an academic. And you have all also talked about the academic institution, that there is a silencing through academics, but as well, you're all speaking here as intellectuals. So what I'm likely to ask you all is, and also as you address to say, we shouldn't focus so much on racism, but much more our understanding of the category of race as an analytical lens. So how should conditions of knowledge production of anti-racism in Europe, and I would like to focus a bit on Europe because all the conference is on Europe, how that should look like, what is important to that knowledge production. And I would like to hear your stance on that. So before you ask me who should start, I would like to ask Piero to start because he seemed to be the last person. And Piero, please start, and then everybody of you just jump in and catch up.
Sorry, I was having internet connection issues, but I think what you were asking was how the question of policy relates to how the. Can you repeat the question again? Sorry, I got disconnected.
Yeah, the question was how the condition of knowledge production, in particular in Europe, should look like in knowledge production on anti-racism.
Thank you. I mean, for me, primarily it's a question of referencing. So that would be one of the issues that I find most fascinating sometimes, that I will read a question on, let's say, anti-Roma racism, and the work of Fatma El-Tayeb or Gilroy or Stuart Hall is missing, or local Roma sources are not cited. And so what passes for proper academic knowledge and prestige, and rather one should use some sources of academic knowledge other than others, needs to be destabilized. I'm not sure how, because Europe obviously thrives on the idea of institutions having certain traditions and longevity, and it deploys this as a way of sidelining and marginalizing further voices that may seem or that are calling for the decolonization of the European knowledge production, curriculum, knowledge gathering processes as well. And I mean, I think it's also difficult to address this issue for all of Europe, because there's different things happening across Europe. So, for instance, in the UK, I would say it's the curriculum, especially with students around the SOAS university, as I remember at least 2 years ago. Similarly, in France, the movement that Najira mentioned, the 100 signatures against Islamogauchism, that may be a reaction, but it's a reaction to the fact that there is actually a process through which academics and anti-racist activists in France are strongly shaking the foundations of French high knowledge, let's call it. But then when we speak of Germany, for instance, I mean, frankly, there's nothing, in the sense that German institutions are very different, from my experience, from, let's say, France or the UK, in the sense that there's a very strict resistance to defining all of this as inconsequential knowledge, as hearsay, as unbalanced, as radical, as unacademic. And so that's why in Germany, perhaps, you have spaces which are completely alienated and outside of knowledge production. So, for instance, in Göttingen, when I lived, there were activist spaces who were very radical and who did really interesting work around anti-racism and refugee solidarity. But then the institutions in Göttingen, which were the main knowledge producers on questions of refugees and racism, such as the Max Planck Institute and University of Göttingen, they were completely disconnected from these networks. And so I think there's a different approach across Europe, and I'm not sure that there's one particular way in which actions to silence racism. If there was one ground rule, I would say that can be applied across the idea that anti-racist discourse, racism, to bring up these very questions, as many of them essentially unacademic, and in knowledge production and knowledge accumulation.
Just to follow on what was mentioned about France, but beyond, I think that there is a strong trend today that we should not downplay, which has to do with that knowledge production is not only the purpose and the matter of academics. It has already been completely taken over in a very beneficial way by all kind of informal groups, all kind of collectives, all kind of activist circles. And I think this is something that should also be taken very carefully and taken seriously. For example, what you were just mentioning, Piero, about the fact that there's this connection between mobilizations in the French society at large and academics in certain disciplines or certain thematic fields is happening, but there's also a backlash that's happening with regard to that. So we should not. There's also this notion that this has to be these ties, these relations, and these connections between inside and outside academia should be very much taken care of in order that they become sustainable in the longer term. And this also means that to some extent, the Western white production of knowledge has to be in some ways dismantled and challenged and decentered in such ways that we understand that knowledge is not just the purpose of certain institutions and not of all the society at large. And so it means that in many of the issues that we are considering in the conference that you organize and in the societies we are talking about, this means that these issues and the phenomenon that we have to address will certainly require our full attention to the experience of those that experience the racism and the structural racism and the state racism, rather than to consider them as just objects of research. They have to be narrowly associated to what we are trying to understand and to make available for the broader societies that we belong to and beyond. So it means that this also implies that the space and the place of power that we are sitting in should also be dismantled in some large ways, so that the space is being made for other voices and other perspectives and other analyses can be heard. And so that's interesting that you mentioned references. So should we reference beyond minorities among academia, or should we reference also activists and all collectives that produce knowledge with relation to race and anti-racism and racism?
Can I jump in on that point, referencing? I think this is crucial, and I think I always find it hilarious when people, other academics, sort of suggest that it's somehow unacademic to reference people who are not academics, right? Because I think everything that both Piero and Nasira have said basically points to the fact that the majority of knowledge production that is actually cutting edge, to use a phrase I don't really like, but it is 5 a.m. and I'm a little bit tired, is being done by non-academics. And the reason that it's being done by non-academics is not only because, yes, these are people who are on the ground, right? That's obvious. But there are other structural reasons which are to do with Noah's question, right? So firstly, academics, I think we all know what it means when we work within academic institutions, are beset by all kinds of bureaucratic jobs, basically bullshit jobs, to quote David Graeber, that take us away from doing the work that we need to be doing, which is primarily teaching and research. And that's by design. That's the first thing. And I think that means it doesn't give us the time and the space to be engaging in the necessary hard work that needs to be done, also the work of connection with the people on the ground. Rather, there's this kind of instrumentalization of them, as you correctly said, Nasira, as objects of research or ways in order to bring money into an institution which is under, neoliberal managerialism and, the declining arts and humanities and social sciences is the only way to keep the university afloat, which then connects to what passes for legitimate research on race, which when we look at the EU, when we look at the national funding bodies, also here in Australia, is quite frankly not the kind of research that I think anybody on this panel would actually want to be doing. I know that there are ways to massage your research into the framework of these funding bodies. I've never been successful. Somebody maybe one day will give me the key to being successful. Frankly, I also sort of don't care because I think that these institutions are really problematic in framing the types of questions that can be asked and the types of questions that are beyond the pale, which then leads me to this kind of conference. I mean, I think everybody here is raising really important questions, but we're also doing it as people who sit outside of the German context. I know that both Piero and Eddie have been involved very heavily in Germany, myself and Asiel perhaps not so much, but I have visited and interacted with German scholars and activists for many years. However, we are still outsiders who are then permitted to come in and sort of comment on situations in German politics of race, let's say. So the types of issues that I raised in my talk about the instrumentalization of the war on anti-Semitism and so on, in ways that German activists and knowledge producers, again, the people who are not within the academy very often because they've been pushed out of the academy and not allowed in by the structures of white academia, they are not here, right? They are not allowed to speak. And so what that begs the question is, what is the use of these types of conversations, right? How do they connect up to the very real material struggles of people who are, after all, living the situations that we are then trying to theorize and analyze, even as we, of course, live them ourselves. So these are questions that I think that organizations like the Rat für Migration has to think about in the way it itself is governed by the imperatives of the funding bodies and German academia and so on, if we are ever going to break this sort of interminable cycle of kind of sidelining radical knowledge production on race by those who are most concerned in the local context.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think maybe I'll bring a slightly different dimension to this with the discipline of law, which also I think has a slightly different but similar gatekeeping function around who's allowed to produce legal knowledge, and this idea of the expert who has to then be legally qualified to be able to then expound on not only the law, but anything that the law touches. So in order to talk about law and race, in some circles of legal academia, only the lawyers who are interested primarily in what judges say and how to interpret the legislation are given a platform to talk about that. So, and in Germany, it's quite extreme because to be in legal academia, you're only taken seriously if you do a certain type of kind of legal scholarly work. And I think, two examples that I think help us destabilize that in a really productive way is, on one hand, the Uri Jallo trial that I mentioned has been really led by activists, family members, and friends of Uri Jallo and non-lawyers who got involved over the years with pushing a public conversation that then had an implication on the legal debate quite directly. So examples are they produced fire experiments that then influenced the state prosecutor's office to reconsider and open a special investigation. And, it basically produces pressure. But it really also opens up a broader conversation about what kinds of questions the law should be asking. So there's no inquest procedure in Germany where you can ask questions about a person's death beyond the liability questions that are asked in court. And if the court doesn't allow certain questions, no one can ask them in an official capacity. So it takes activists and family members to change that system, and they've changed it, at least for this case, in various ways that have had impacts in Germany. Or, to everyone's shock, when an episode of Tatort, which is the German kind of version of the police forensics television program, kind of like a CSI in Germany, very well regarded and well watched. When the episode that recreated the Uri Jallo case mentioned institutional racism and used the term, a lot of people were quite surprised because it wasn't a mainstream term. And I'm not saying that it's only because of the Uri Jallo case, but I think the last 15 years between the NSU murders and public discourse around how to respond to racism when we can't find the vocabulary and to use this vocabulary that's in other contexts, and this goes back to these experiences being relational, it became apparent that this was available and important. So I think that wouldn't have happened if it were only left to legal experts that were going to operate within the standard kind of protected zone of legal expertise. And then another example is a textbook that I'm working on with some others, which is about race in Europe. And the format of a legal textbook is typically to tell you what the cases say and what the legal opinions mean, and not really to do a lot of analysis around that. So we're trying to change that by having a really quite a broad view on race and bringing in cases that don't only deal with race as in discrimination cases where race is named, but to look at how the law impacts on people with regard to race. So to make it quite broad, and also do the work around the different contexts in Europe and how words and translations of original cases make a difference to how we see these concepts as unified. Because there are so many languages in Europe, the only comparative work that tends to be done on race is at the level of when the case makes it all the way to the European Union or the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, rather than to look at the local cases in the original languages in various countries across Europe to see what the local inflections are on these common kind of systems of racism. So it's going to be an imperfect attempt to try to do something beyond what's expected in legal academia, but it at least, I think, approaches the question of what counts as good knowledge, what counts as knowledge production within academia. So that's both a kind of a non-legal and a legal approach to that question.
May I ask you something with regard to that, if that's okay with you? It's fine. This is most interesting because this reminds me of a conversation I once had in a conference in Germany regarding cases of veiled women that were dealt with at the land level or at the federal level. And I remember discussing with a German lawyer that said that when the decision has to be made, the judge has to be able to exert himself from the social and political debate that takes place at that very time in the society in order to make the proper decision that can be just for all parties. And I found that very interesting, this notion of exiting the society at the very moment when you make a law decision. And I think that would be, you know, this for one, I thought this was completely an idealistic way of dealing with how law functions and how could law be, you know, kind of taken out of the society literally. And I think that would be very useful to understand how to historicize and how to socialize cases that are related to race, and how racialization that does not stop at the moment when the law decision is being made, but rather that it is entrenched in the way the law decision is being made. And that would be very enlightening for a lot of people that think that, you know, justice is something that lies above the societies and the people who are engaged in legal issues. So that's really interesting to hear you on that.
Thank you. And just quickly, I mean, it is really one of those things that makes law so inward looking and kind of purposefully isolationist from what's happening in society, is this idea that in order to have a good judge make a good judgment, they need to be as distant as possible from the political and social context, because their view is only from, you know, the facts of the case to the sentencing, and they aren't to look outside of that. And I think there's some variation in some places. There's more willingness to kind of look at a range of factors, especially once you get to the sentencing or, you know, but in some places, and I think civil law jurisdictions, like in continental Europe, are on the other end of that extreme, where there's a very clear way of interpreting the statutes, and that always kind of takes this distanced approach. And I guess there are downsides to being, to reopening the principles for every case, so that you're kind of determining kind of a moral middle ground for the court for every case. But at the same time, it really is just then, it's always going to be two steps behind where society is in making a reasoned judgment about the political context and whether the law should have moved on. I mean, it's a perennial problem, which is why I think legal knowledge is a very poor form of knowledge in that sense, in the sense of judging things that are divorced from lived experience and from the context.
Regarding the time, I would say I have to make an announcement. We have a new coalition agreement in Germany just now, and we hope in the new coalition agreement we will have the possibility to have the first anti-racism commission in the history of Germany. Okay. Thanks for everything. It was a big pleasure and a big honor to having all of us today here. Alana, my head is to Australia now. Thanks, more of all.
Sun is rising outside. Finally.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Asira. Thanks, Andy. And thanks, Piero. Thanks, Noah. And vielen Dank für das ganze Auditorium. Wir haben heute genug, glaube ich, konferiert. Es war ein sehr anstrengender und interessanter Tag.
First day. Tomorrow we will continue. And, well, I hope to see you again tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. It was a great pleasure to have you here on the panel, and it was so insightful. And we have another day, 2 more days. So I hope the people in the audience join. Also, for all of you who have been guests on the panel, might join in. It's a pity that we don't see each other in presence. I hope one day we will have that opportunity, but thank you so much for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us here. And have a good day, good morning, and a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. And be well.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Sleep well, Alana.